It still feels strange saying this out loud, but I used to be the senior cybersecurity analyst at a mid-sized software firm in Seattle. 6 years, countless late nights, and more than a few holiday weekends spent in the office watching firewall logs instead of fireworks. My name's Lora, and I thought I was pretty good at what I did until one Tuesday afternoon when I found myself packing up my desk, my badge already deactivated. The office lights seemed colder that day, like they somehow knew I wasn't coming back. My coffee mug, the one with the little crack near the handle, didn't make it into the box. Neither did the sticky notes with hand-drawn smiley faces left by coworkers over the years. What did make it in were 6 years of lessons, half a dozen ID cards, and one security manual I wrote during a weekend outage when no one else picked up the phone. Henry stood near the door with his arms crossed, silent but smug. He was the new guy brought in from some fast-tracked executive program. Slick suit, tighter haircut, and a look that said he already had a TED Talk in mind. He didn't understand what I did, but he sure thought he did. Said everything I'd been doing could now be handled by automated systems. Called it efficiency. The funny thing is, I didn't argue. I didn't try to defend myself, didn't shout, didn't cry. Maybe I should have. But something about that moment felt final. Like the decision had been made long before the meeting was scheduled. My voice wouldn't have mattered to someone who had already decided I was obsolete. I remember passing Janet from accounting. Her eyes darted away, and I don't blame her. It's hard watching someone disappear from a place they helped build. No speeches, no send-off. Just a cardboard box and a quiet elevator ride down. That silence, it weighed more than anything I carried. I wasn't angry. Not really. But there was this ache in my chest. A dull, steady kind. Like when someone forgets your birthday not out of malice just because they never saw you in the first place. That's what it felt like. Being erased by someone who never even took the time to learn your name. And still, even then, I kept thinking about the systems. About the things no automation could possibly understand. But that, I figured, wasn't my problem anymore. Henry arrived with the kind of confidence that usually comes wrapped in a resume stamped by Stanford. He shook hands like a politician and talked like a man who had just read 3 leadership books in a row. To him, our cybersecurity team wasn't a group of specialists protecting the company's backbone. We were inefficiencies waiting to be streamlined. He called himself a visionary. Most of us just call him new. Fresh suit, fresh title, and barely a month into the job before he started asking questions like why we still had human eyes on firewall logs or why our email servers weren't fully migrated to cloud-based AI filters. It didn't take long to realize he was less interested in how things worked and more interested in how they looked in slides. Meetings with him always felt like watching a tech demo sold by someone who didn't know how to code. He loved graphs, loved saying words like synergy and scalability. Once during a system vulnerability review, he interrupted me to suggest that instead of patching legacy servers, we just upgrade everything and let AI handle the rest. I tried to explain that our infrastructure wasn't built in a day and it couldn't be fixed in a slideshow. He nodded like he heard me, then circled back to his PowerPoint deck. To be fair, Henry wasn't dumb, just dangerously confident in things he didn't understand. He treated cybersecurity like an expense to reduce, not a necessity to protect. He once joked that I was too attached to my scripts, like I'd written poetry instead of protocols. And maybe I was. But I knew which patch clashed with which firmware. Henry knew which budget line item made his numbers look good. What frustrated me wasn't just his arrogance. It was how quickly he won people over. Execs loved him. He spoke their language. Short sentences, bold predictions, and an annual cost savings of $120,000 if we just automated human error out of the equation. I remember thinking that the only thing more dangerous than a hacker was a confident executive with no experience and a boardroom full of yes-men. The decision to eliminate my position wasn't personal to him. It was strategic. Clean lines, no emotional mess, Just numbers on a spreadsheet that said my job was obsolete. He probably high-fived someone afterward. Meanwhile, I went home and unplugged my monitoring server for the first time in 6 years. Looking back, I don't think Henry hated me. I don't even think he knew me. To him, I was just another outdated line item standing in the way of progress. And in his world, progress had no room for nuanced history or quiet competence. Just automation and optimism, backed by bullet points. Most people never saw the real work I did, and honestly, that was fine with me. I wasn't the kind of person who made a show of staying late or checking in during holidays. But if you were watching network traffic at 2 a.m. on Christmas Eve, chances are you'd have seen me logged in from my apartment eyes on the dashboard, coffee going cold beside me. I built my own monitoring scripts because the off-the-shelf tools missed too much. I knew exactly which devices on our network acted strangely after updates and which systems couldn't handle standard patches without crashing. I created a database of quirks. Over the years, every glitch, every delay, every moment the system hesitated when it shouldn't. There were nights I'd catch phishing attempts that slipped through AI filters because the emails mimicked our vendor style just well enough. AI flagged them as routine. I flagged them as dangerous. And I was right. Other times it was watching for signs of a brute force attack, failed login attempts that weren't quite enough to trigger alarms, but came from just the right locations at just the right hours. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I knew what would happen if I didn't. I remembered the time we nearly lost 3 days of financial data during a weekend update. The automated backup failed silently. I caught it 5 minutes before the rollback window closed. No one ever heard about it. No one needed to. When we acquired 2 smaller firms and had to merge their infrastructure, I was the one who tested compatibility line by line. Everyone else just assumed the systems would talk to each other. I knew better. Legacy systems don't speak fluent cloud. They mutter and they glitch, and if you're not listening closely, they break. Somewhere along the line, I became the person people called after hours when something felt off, not when the alarms went off. Before that, when something just didn't feel right. It wasn't magic, it was an experience. It was context. It was 1,000 little notes in my head and a gut instinct trained by years of watching, learning, and fixing things that didn't show up on reports. There's no metric for that, no slide that shows why that kind of work matters. But it did. It always did. Even if nobody saw it. I spent the afternoon after my termination doing what I'd always done, protecting the company. Not out of loyalty anymore, but because I couldn't leave knowing I hadn't at least tried to warn them. I compiled everything into one final document, 67 pages long, labeled and color-coded with critical points flagged in red. It wasn't just a checklist. It was a roadmap. Every manual override I had created, every system that required human intervention, every vulnerability I knew automation couldn't touch. I included annotated diagrams, escalation protocols, vendor contacts, and even sample scripts that had saved us more times than anyone realized. When I sent the file, I copied HR, the director of operations, and the CEO. But the one who replied was Henry. His message was short. A thank you, nothing more. No follow-up, no questions. No signs that he'd actually read the part about our outdated email servers or the firewall clusters that failed auto-patching without triggering alerts. I had tracking on the email. I saw the moment he opened the attachment. 6 minutes. 67 pages in 6 minutes. He hadn't read it. He'd scanned maybe. Or just clicked through enough to say he had. And that was that. The last warning was given. The last chance missed. I didn't chase him down. I didn't send a second email. I knew what kind of leader he was. He didn't want details. He wanted confirmation bias. And my documentation didn't fit his narrative of clean automation and 0 staffing costs. So I archived the email, saved the receipts, and walked away. Not with anger, with clarity. The kind that settles into your bones when you've done everything right and still watch the wrong person make the final call. They didn't just ignore me. They ignored the system itself. The cracks I'd been patching by hand, the warning signs only a human would recognize. I had highlighted them, boxed them in red, and titled them Critical Intervention Required. But none of that mattered to someone who believed real problems didn't exist if you didn't look closely. And maybe that's what made it worse. Not that I was dismissed, but that the danger was visible, obvious, almost screaming from the page, and still no one listened. It started with unusual login traffic. A few failed attempts scattered across odd hours, nothing aggressive enough to trigger alerts, but strange enough to catch the eye of someone who knew what to look for. Only there was no one left to look, not anymore. By the time the automated system flagged a full breach, it was already too late. An attacker had slipped through the exact vulnerability I outlined in red on page 43. The same one Henry skimmed and shrugged off. They went straight for the email servers, bypassed authentication, and made their way into the client database like it was built for them. Customer names, addresses, billing info, licensing codes, everything. Downloaded, mirrored, and exfiltrated before the system even logged a full anomaly. It was clean, efficient, and deliberate. Not a brute force attack. A scalpel, not a hammer. Panic didn't hit the executive floor until ransom demands followed. $2 million in Bitcoin or they'd leak the data to the public. Legal froze. Marketing scrambled. And Henry, for the first time since arriving, didn't have a slide deck to hide behind. I wasn't there. I heard pieces later. How he stammered through explanations to the board. How he tried to blame the legacy systems without acknowledging the person he'd fired who understood them. How the FBI showed up the next morning and asked why the company had ignored internal documentation outlining the very weaknesses now exposed. I read about it on a forum first. Hackers were trading tips on how to bypass hybrid server setups. One thread mentioned our exact configuration. Another linked to a vulnerability list I'd flagged 2 years ago. Public knowledge now, all of it. Somewhere in that chaos, someone must have remembered my name. Probably Sarah from operations. Probably the moment they realized nothing automated could help them anymore. But by then, the damage was done. I didn't feel angry. Just still. Like watching a wave crash that I saw forming days before. They called it a sophisticated breach. I called it predictable. The call came just after 8 on a Tuesday morning. I was mid-sip of my second coffee when Sarah's name lit up my phone. Her voice was tight, practiced calm, barely holding back urgency. They needed help. Specifically, they needed me. I let the silence hang for a beat longer than usual before answering. I don't work there anymore. She didn't argue. She just said there was a breach and Henry was in full panic mode. Then she paused, as if that alone should be enough to explain everything. When did it happen? I already knew the answer. Overnight, just like I predicted. The attack had landed in the one place no one left in that building knew how to secure. Sarah's voice dropped when she mentioned the ransom. Then she asked, would I consider coming in? I didn't gloat. I didn't ask what changed their minds. I just said I'd need full access, reinstated a written contract, and my prior salary, plus the raise I was denied last year. She didn't even hesitate. Done, she said. I added one more thing. I want direct authority over all automated systems. No interference. There was a pause, then the quiet click of a keyboard in the background. James, the CEO, was on the line now. His voice didn't shake, but it carried weight. He said they needed someone who understood the systems, the real systems, not just the architecture charts. He said they should have listened sooner. I gave them 30 minutes. When I walked through the lobby that morning, Dennis at security gave me a nod I hadn't seen since the day I left. The kind that said, finally, someone's doing the right thing. I stepped into the elevator not as an employee, not as someone coming to ask for her job back, but as the only person who knew how to fix the mess they'd created. It felt different this time. Not revenge, not validation, just clarity. For once, they saw me for what I had been all along. I stepped out of the elevator and into the same office I'd left just a week earlier. Only this time, it didn't feel like I was returning. It felt like I'd arrived. The tension was thick enough to taste. People looked up not with surprise, but with quiet relief, like the grown-up had finally walked into the room. The conference room was packed. FBI agents sat at one end, typing quietly, while glancing at network maps projected on the screen. Sarah looked exhausted, her blazer wrinkled and a stack of printed reports was scattered in front of her. James stood with his hands behind his back, staring out the window. And Henry was pacing phone in hand, sweat just beginning to stain his collar. When he saw me, his face twisted into something that tried to look calm, but missed the mark. He opened his mouth, but I walked past him without breaking stride. Sarah nodded at me and slid a chair back from the table. I placed a printed binder on the polished surface, the same one I had emailed a week ago, and opened it to page 43. James asked the question. Why weren't these warnings acted on? I didn't say a word. I just watched Henry freeze. He looked down, then up, then back at the binder like he had never seen it before. But the read receipt said otherwise. So did the timestamp. So did the silence in the room. Henry started to speak, but James held up a hand. It wasn't just about the breach anymore. It was about negligence, about arrogance, about letting ego override expertise. I didn't gloat. I didn't even look at Henry. I turned to Sarah and began explaining the emergency protocol I would implement over the next 48 hours. Within minutes, I was back in my rhythm, routing traffic through backups, segmenting compromised endpoints, re-establishing access controls by hand. I issued commands with authority and made decisions with the calm of someone who had been through worse and had prepared for this exact scenario. An hour later, Henry was gone. No dramatic exit, just a quiet walk out the door with security by his side and a box of personal items in his hands. The same cardboard kind I carried not long ago. No one said anything. No one needed to. The silence was its own verdict. When I returned to my desk, it had been cleaned. A new computer waited, already configured. A fresh badge sat beside the keyboard, and an email from HR welcomed me back with a subject line that included my new title, Senior Security Strategist. I now report directly to the CEO. I had final say over every protocol involving automated systems. Later that afternoon, Sarah stopped by with coffee and a pause, heavy enough to mean something. She said we should have listened. I nodded. You should have read your email. She almost smiled. Almost. The breach would cost the company more than just money. Clients would need reassurance. Legal teams would work overtime. But one thing was certain now. They finally understood the difference between redundancy and resilience. And that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. I've always believed technology is powerful, but it's never been the answer by itself. It's a tool, one that's only as good as the people who know when to trust it and when to question it. The difference between a silent system and a secure one is usually just a person who cares enough to look closer. What happened at that company wasn't just a failure of software. It was a failure of perspective, a belief that speed and efficiency could replace instinct and experience. That if something isn't broken loudly, it must be working fine. But the truth is, most systems fail quietly. Most red flags don't scream. They blink briefly, waiting for someone to notice. And some lessons, no matter how advanced our tools become, still have to be learned the hard way. I'm not glad the breach happened. It costs too much. But I am glad it made something clear. Expertise can't be replaced with shortcuts. Judgment doesn't come in a software update. And the value of people who quietly keep things running shouldn't depend on a disaster to be seen. If you've ever been in a job where your impact wasn't visible until you were gone, I'd like to hear your story. If you've ever been told your work could be replaced only to watch that theory collapse, I hope this gave you a little comfort. Because in the end, what saved that company wasn't a machine, it was a person. And sometimes being human is the best defense we've got.